Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In April 1974, student Susan Rancourt suddenly and inexplicably vanished without trace. Her disappearance was similar to that of 3 other young college-aged women who went missing under suspicious circumstances. Almost a year later, his skull was positively identified among others found on Taylor Mountain, one of serial killer Ted Bundy's grave sites. In Seattle, Washington during 1974, young women of college age started to go missing with startling frequency. Beginning in January, with the apparent kidnapping of Linda and Healy and the disappearance of Donna Manson, who left her dormitory at Evergreen State College to attend a jazz concert in March, but never arrived. There were few witnesses who saw these women during the hours before they vanished, and there was never any reason to suspect that the 2 cases were connected to a single perpetrator. That all changed in April 1974, when several women came forward to report how they were approached by a man wearing his arm in a sling who asking for help. The first instance happened on April 12th, Good Friday, when a sorority girl was accosted outside the campus library at Central Washington State University in Ellensburg, Washington, by a man with his arm in a sling and a metal brace on his finger. She later told detectives that he appeared to be having trouble carrying his armload of books, dropping several of them. The young woman offered her assistance and escorted the man to his Volkswagen Beetle that was parked 300 yards away. When they arrived at the vehicle, the woman noticed something bizarre. The front passenger seat was missing. The 2 chatted for several minutes about how the young man had injured his arm skiing at Crystal Mountain. Although the man seemed friendly, the young woman couldn't shake the sense of unease she felt about him and the missing seat in his Volkswagen. The urge to get away suddenly overcame her, and she placed the books on the roof of the vehicle and ran as fast as she could. She didn't know it, but her intuition saved her life. Just 5 days later, another young woman would not be so lucky. Born on October 12, 1955, Susan Elaine Rancourt was also a student at Central Washington State University in Ellensburg, Washington, and she too had an encounter with a strange young man. On the evening of April 17, 1974, Susan Rancourt left dorm on the college campus to attend a meeting for living group advisors on the lower campus. The meeting at 9 p.m. was about a potential job, and afterwards Rancourt had made plans to watch a German film with a friend, but she never arrived. She was last seen around 10:30 p.m. walking across Central Washington State College lawns. By 3 a.m., her roommate Diana Pitt of Yakima called the dorm manager because she had not returned. "I got worried she wasn't back," said Pitt. After the report was turned over to the campus police, a massive search was undertaken. The search involved around 150 volunteers who walked across Ellensburg, checking the college, abandoned buildings and sewers that covered a 2-mile radius of the city. But nothing was found. A missing person case was investigated by police, who thought Rancourt might have stayed with friends or had gone away for some unknown reason. A reward was put up by her parents of $1,000 for any information that led to her whereabouts. Susan Rancourt was described as 18 years old, white, 5'2" and 118 pounds, with blue eyes, blonde shoulder-length hair. On the night she went missing, she was wearing a bright yellow fingertip-length ski jacket without a hood, gray corduroy slacks, a yellow short-sleeved sweater, and brown hush puppy shoes. A straight-A freshman biology student, Susan Rancourt was considered very smart and sensible by her friends and family. Her father Dale Rancourt said although police had no leads, they were certain she had been abducted. Taking time away from his job with the Anchorage telephone utility, Rancourt helped with the search for his daughter. Police received leads that led from Sitka, Alaska, to Boynton Beach, Florida, alongside one that pointed to Australia. "We believe Susan was abducted because she was always a very logical person, very predictable," her father said. "If it was one of my other children, I'd say just stand by, they'll be back in 2 or 3 days, but not Susan, she was always very careful." Dale Rancourt said Susan had put her laundry in the washing machine before heading to her campus meeting. The month after Susan Rancourt's disappearance, Kathleen Parks was reported missing from Oregon State University. In June, Brenda Ball was last seen after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien after talking with a man with his arm in a sling. Later that same month, Georgianne Hawkins simply vanished from an alley behind her sorority house. These women were all pretty, college-aged women who were similar in appearance, trusting, and it soon became apparent that these cases might be connected. The Pacific Northwest police agencies attempted to find a common link. However, it only became apparent when two women vanished on the same day. On July 14, 1974, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were abducted hours apart at the Lake Sammamish State Park, where hundreds of people had gathered during the hot summer day. Witnesses came forward to tell police that the two women were seen approached by a young man with his arm in sling, and who introduced himself as Ted. That day, the stranger known as Ted approached several women at Lake Sammamish in an attempt to get them to leave with him to help load a sailboat onto his car. Several women refused, but Ott and Naslund went with the man with his arm in a sling. They were never seen again. Shortly after this, two witnesses came forward with information. On April 17th, the same night Susan Rancourt went missing, a young man was seen on crutches at Ellensburg by several witnesses at about 7 p.m. This man approached a sorority girl, Jane Curtis, asking for help carry his books, and she readily agreed to help because of his handicap. When they approached his car, she recounted for the police what happened next. She noticed the front passenger seat was missing and sensed something wasn't right. The young man asked Curtis if she could get inside his car, but she declined. When he pressed her a second time, she dropped the books and ran. She described the man to police as well-dressed and wearing glasses. The son of an Oregon district attorney who was visiting the campus also came forward and reported seeing a man with his arm in a sling standing in front of the Bardo Hall around 8:30 p.m. on the same evening. Later, at about 10 p.m., another sorority girl, 21-year-old Catherine Clara DeLivo, was approached by a man asking for help taking books to his car. When they arrived at his parked car, a tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle, the young man suddenly dropped the keys on the floor. He then asked the girl to retrieve them. However, DeLivo said she could see the light shining on the keys on the ground, and picked them up, placing them in his hand before she walked away. DeLivo said the man is wearing shabby clothing and a woolen hat, a description that was at odds with Jane Curtis' earlier description. Barbara Blair also came forward and stated to police that she saw a young woman in a bright yellow raincoat exiting Munson Hall. This description matched what Rancourt was wearing that evening. Another witness claimed he saw a man loitering in the parking lot and smoking with his right hand. He later saw a vehicle on his drive back to Seattle. These reports, although crucial to the investigation, did little to point detectives in the right direction. Shortly after the disappearance of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, there were no further reports of missing women in Washington. It would be several months later, in October, that more women vanished in the state of Utah. In March 1975, two forestry students came across a disturbing find when they stumbled upon human remains while walking through a swampy, wooded area on Taylor Mountain at Issaquah. Police eventually unearthed 4 skulls and other bones fragments at the site, located east of Seattle, and only 10 miles from a site where the skulls of Ott and Naslund were found in September 1974. The remains were eventually identified as belonging to Linda and Healy, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, and Susan Rancourt. On the day Rancourt's skull was identified, her father Dale was with his daughter's dentist in Anchorage when dental x-rays confirmed it was her. A mandible found at the site was also confirmed as belonging to Susan Rancourt. The King County Medical Examiner had taken x-rays that were then mailed special delivery to Rancourt's dentist in Alaska. There were several points of identification that made us almost sure the skull was Rancourt's, said Police Chief Al Pickles. This switches the case from a missing person to a homicide, he added. Now we have to make an attempt to determine in which jurisdiction the homicide occurred. Police were now convinced that a serial killer was responsible for the murders of young college students in Seattle, and the unknown man who called himself Ted was now the prime suspect in as many as 8 abductions and murders. Detectives started to search for anyone named Ted who lived or worked in the area, along with any owners of a Volkswagen Beetle. These were all common threads in some of the abductions, and witnesses came forward that each told a similar story of being approached by a man who feigned a handicap to gain their trust and help. With a list of possible suspects, investigators began to narrow the list down to find the killer. In August 1975, a suspect was arrested in the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch, who was abducted from the Fashion Place shopping mall in Murray, Utah. The man, Ted Bundy, was pulled over while driving his tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle, which was found to have what could best be described as a murder kit in the trunk, that consisted of rope, handcuffs, a pantyhose mask, balaclava, and other assorted burglary items. After he was implicated in the kidnapping of Duranch, detectives in Colorado wanted to question Bundy over the kidnapping and murder of Karen Campbell, who went missing from Snowmass Village, Colorado in January 1975. A forensic search of Bundy's vehicle found hair strands that matched 3 different victims. Charged and sentenced to 1 to 15 years for the Duranch kidnapping, Bundy was soon charged with the Karen Campbell murder and was transferred to Aspen to prepare for his trial. It was during this time that Bundy orchestrated 2 daring escapes, the last of which saw him flee to Florida, where he perpetrated more murders. Finally captured one again on February 15, 1978, Ted Bundy was charged with the Chi Omega murders and the murder of 15-year-old Kimberly Leach. Found guilty in both of these trials, Bundy was sentenced to death and transferred to the Rayford prison in Florida, where he would spend the next decade on death row. Although Bundy protested his innocence throughout his incarceration, he did offer detectives some information on the murders, but never once did he offer any type of acknowledgement that he was responsible for the murder of Susan Rancourt. It was only in the final hours before his execution in January 1989 that he confessed. Bundy admitted to the kidnapping and murder of Susan Rancourt. That evening, April 17, 1974, he had approached several students in an attempt to carry out an abduction, but none of his intended victims fell for his deception. Bundy had used this same method on several victims, a method that was intended to disarm them. He would appear handicapped, having made and fitted a fake plaster cast, with materials he had taken from his previous employment with a medical supply company, and used the cast on either his arm or leg in order to appear helpless. Bundy would then carry a large amount of books and appeared to struggle to carry them. His intended victim would either offer to help, or he would request it himself. Once they accompanied him to his vehicle, Bundy would talk to them in an attempt to put them at ease. The victim would then place the books down on the seat of his Volkswagen, and as they knelt down, Bundy bludgeoned them in the head with a crowbar he had hidden under the wheel arch of his car. With the unconscious Susan Rancourt in his Volkswagen, Bundy drove her towards his burial site at Taylor Mountain, where his skull was later found. It is possible that her body was buried elsewhere, as Bundy confessed that he decapitated some of his victims in Washington and Utah, taking the heads home with him. It is likely he did this with Rancourt, and later buried her head with the others that were found there. The witness who saw a suspicious man smoking might have seen Bundy waiting to abduct a victim, and later saw his Volkswagen Bug, with the unconscious Susan on his way to the Issaquah burial site, where her remains were found a year later. Like his other victims, Rancourt was likely strangled, raped post-mortem, and her body then used by Bundy for several weeks after death. Rancourt's skull was found intact, unlike other victims who had suffered fractures from his use of a crowbar to incapacitate. As she was only his 3rd victim, it is possible that Bundy had yet to perfect his method of rendering them unconscious. Like all of Ted Bundy's victims, Susan Rancourt had a promising and bright future ahead of her that was cruelly snatched away by a senseless act of murder. At 18, Rancourt was at the younger end of his victims, who were usually aged in the 20s. For his crimes, Ted Bundy would pay the ultimate price in the electric chair Old Sparky. Case 2. On July 4, 1975, Nancy Baird vanished from where she worked at a gas station in East Layton. Police soon found eyewitnesses who saw 2 men talking with Baird shortly before she disappeared. After investigating several persons of interest in the Baird case, detectives came to suspect she had fallen victim to serial killer Ted Bundy. By July 1975, Nancy Perry Baird was living in East Layton, Utah, and working as an attendant at a Fina brand gas station and convenience store near the southwest corner of U.S. Highway 89 and Cherry Lane. Baird was 23 years old and a single mother with a 4-year-old son, who she was raising on her own with help from her parents. Born in Provo, Utah, on January 14, 1952, Baird married young, shortly after she left high school, and had a child with her then husband Floyd D. Baird. The union was not a happy one and lasted only a few brief years. Her husband moved to Wyoming, and Nancy relied on her parents to look after her young son. On July 4, 1975, Nancy left her son with her parents at their home in the small town of East Layton, Utah, and went to work. That day seemed like any other, and Baird served customers who stopped for gas and store items. Between 5:10 p.m. and 5:15 p.m., the town's only full-time officer, David Ray Anderson, stopped at the Fina station. In his report for that day, Anderson wrote that he interacted with Baird with nothing out of the ordinary. He then left the station and drove to another gas station on the opposite corner of the highway. Anderson wrote in his report that when he looked back in the direction of the Fina station, around 5:30 p.m., he noticed a green van parked outside. He went over to check it out, but it is unknown if Officer Anderson made contact with the driver or what became of the incident. But by the time he arrived back at the Fina station, he found that Nancy Baird was no longer there. Her purse, containing medication and $167 from a cashed check, and keys were still inside, and her car was still parked outside. When Bonnie Peck, manager of the gas station, appeared, she asked Officer Anderson if he had seen Baird, to which he said he had seen her 20 minutes previously. There were no signs that a struggle had taken place inside the convenience store, and together they conducted a search of the area, but found nothing. Anderson called in to his chief, who requested assistance from the Davis County Sheriff's Office in mounting a search for Nancy Baird. East Layton was a town of only about 1,000 residents, and at that time, its police department comprised of only 4 officers, which included a part-time chief, 1 full-time officer, and 2 part-time reserve officers. None of these individuals had attended Utah's police academy, leaving the department understaffed and underexperienced. East Layton police set about working out what happened to Nancy immediately after she vanished from her place of work. They put out a missing persons bullet with information about Baird. She was described as 23 years old, 5'2" in height, weighing 100 pounds with long strawberry blonde hair, hazel eyes and small scars on the inside of each wrist. She was known to wear a small gold pinky ring with rubies, and was wearing a smock with the Fina logo, blue shorts, and a blue halter top. Police then began finding out the identities of customers who had potentially interacted with Nancy by using credit card receipts from the Fina station. One of them was Denzel Williams, a resident of the neighboring town of Kaysville, Utah. Williams was interviewed by Davis County Sheriff's Detective Kenny Payne on July 5, 1975, the day after Nancy was last seen. Williams told Payne that he had taken his 2 children, 14-year-old David and 9-year-old Jana, to the Fina station at about 5:15 p.m. None of the Williams family saw a police officer at the station that day. This meant by the time they arrived there, Officer Anderson had already left for the next station. The Williams children entered the station, with their father remained outside, filling his car with gasoline. Payne then interviewed the Williams children, who reportedly told him they saw 2 men at the counter, talking with Nancy Baird. David Williams said many years later, "I didn't want to interrupt this conversation they were having. They weren't in a hurry to leave or anything." David handed his credit card over to Baird to pay for the gas, and while she completed the transaction, Jana Williams brought over a bottle of raspberry soda. As Jana only had 28 cents for the 29-cent soda, Nancy left her have the bottle for the amount she had. "I do remember that she was very kind," Jana Williams-Gross said. As Officer Anderson had already left, the Williams children were the last people to see Nancy Baird alive. "I didn't know how someone could take a pretty lady like that," Jana said. Detective Payne asked David and Jana Williams to describe the 2 men they saw speaking with Baird. They said both men appeared to be either 23 or 24 years old, and the first was skinny, with shoulder-length hair, a full beard and mustache, and wore a frayed denim jacket. The second man also had a full mustache and beard. His hair was dark but sun-bleached, and he wore a yellow long-sleeved shirt. A tool called identikit was used by Detective Payne to build composite images of the 2 men, based on information provided by David and Jana Williams. These images were never shown to the children, and were subsequently lost from the case files held by the Davis County Sheriff's Office. Almost 50 years later, the Cold podcast used an antique identikit to recreate the composites based on the information contained in Kenny Payne's report. The composites were shown to David and Jana Williams, who both agreed they resembled the men they had witnessed talking to Nancy Baird on the day she went missing. Denzel Williams also told Detective Payne that he noticed a third man outside the Fina station while his kids, David and Jana, were inside the convenience store interacting with Nancy Baird. He described this third man as about 55 to 60 years old, very thin, with prominent veins on his arms. Williams said he didn't see the older man go into the store, and didn't know if he had interacted with Nancy Baird. In the days and weeks after Nancy went missing, police began to narrow down a list of potential persons of interest they wished to talk with. One of these was Baird's ex-husband, Floyd. Baird was quickly ruled out as a suspect after he provided an alibi, telling detectives he'd been camping with a friend in the area of Jackson Hole, Wyoming on the date in question. Detectives then spoke with several of Nancy's current and ex-boyfriend, one of whom was named Dennis Forsgren, who said he had been out of state vacationing with his family at the time. This alibi was later verified by investigators, who next conducted a search of Baird's home. There, they seized her address book, as well as a hairbrush, with strands of her hair tangled in the bristles. They also came across one of her photo albums, the photos of which were compared to the two composite images of the men the Williams children reported seeing inside the Fena station that day. A sheriff's lieutenant wrote, "There was a very similar likeness of one of the identikit composites to a picture from the photo album." The report said the photo was marked with the name Monty, a person who was soon identified as Monty Torres. Jana Williams was shown the photo by detectives, and she positively identified Monty Torres as one of the hippie-type individuals that was in the service station. Davis County detectives learned Torres was in Pocatello, Idaho. They asked the Bannock County, Idaho Sheriff's Office to locate and interview Torres, who was described by a Bannock County detective as quite jittery. Torres said he had an alibi, claiming he'd been at Lava Hot Springs on the afternoon of Nancy Baird's disappearance. He then submitted to a polygraph examination. The outcome of this examination is unknown. However, newspaper clippings from the time seem to indicate the polygraph revealed no signs of deception on Torres' part. As a result, he was cleared as a person of interest. Davis County detectives then decided to speak with Nancy Baird's friends, one of whom had pertinent information for the case. An Ogden woman named Dolores Drake was interviewed in the early days of the investigation and provided information about an incident that occurred in the days before Baird's abduction. Drake reportedly told detectives that 2 nights prior to Nancy's disappearance, they had gone bar hopping along Washington Boulevard in Ogden. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on the morning of July 3, 1975, Nancy Baird dropped Drake off at her home on Ogden's 36th Street. Baird then departed alone, with Drake saying that she presumably headed for her home in Layton. Then Dolores said Baird returned a half hour later, at about 3 a.m. According to Drake, Baird appeared to be quite shaken and frightened, and that this fellow named Tom in a yellow van had followed her home and was molesting her. Drake said she had reportedly overheard Tom as he made threatening sexual comments towards Baird. Drake ordered the man to leave, at which point the man drove away in a yellow Volkswagen van. With the death of Dolores Drake, her accusations against Tom, whose full name is known to law enforcement, cannot be verified. It is unknown if this individual was ever questioned by detectives. By July 28, 1975, Ray Adams, the part-time chief of the East Layton Police, told the Deseret News, "We are at a dead end in the search for Nancy Baird." After 6 weeks, and with assistance from the FBI, the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Baird left detectives no closer to discovering what happened to the single mother of one. Baird's disappearance was one of several of young women who seemingly vanished in Utah between 1974 and 1975. Beginning on October 2, 1974, Nancy Wilcox went missing after she was last seen riding in a yellow Volkswagen near her home in Holiday, Utah. Just over 2 weeks later, Melissa Smith, daughter of the Midvale police chief, vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. Smith's body was later found in American Fork Canyon. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled. On November 8th, a man posing as a police officer attempted to abduct Carol Duranch from the Fashion Place shopping mall in Murray, Utah. Duranch managed to escape from the Volkswagen Beetle, with a pair of handcuffs still fastened to one wrist. Later that same day, Deborah Kent disappeared after leaving a school play in Bountiful, Utah. Utah police became aware that other disappearances had taken place during 1975 in both Colorado and Idaho, but law enforcement were unsure if these incidents of missing women were connected. On June 28, 1975, Susan Curtis disappeared from a youth conference at Brigham Young University. "We had 5 missing women at one time," said former Sheriff William Dub Lawrence. "Half we found part of the bodies, some of them." Lawrence had worked as the Davis County Sheriff, who was in charge of the Baird investigation. With little clue as to what happened to Nancy Baird, detectives could only speculate if her fate was connected to the other missing women. But in August 1975, they got their first clue of a possible suspect. On the evening of August 16, 1975, a yellow Volkswagen Beetle was stopped by police officer Bob Hayward in West Valley. A search of the vehicle produced tools often used for burglaries, However, there were other, more sinister items, such as handcuffs, pantyhose, and a rope. The owner of the vehicle, Ted Bundy, was immediately arrested, and soon he was implicated in the Durant kidnapping, for which he was charged. "When a police officer does this for years, you develop a sixth sense," he said. "You feel it." Bundy was the worst of the worst criminals, and it took its toll on most of us. Lawrence's team of investigators set out to prove it was Bundy who killed Baird. "We had him in Rock Springs, Wyoming, which put him on Interstate 80 coming back from Colorado," Lawrence said. From Rock Springs, Lawrence claimed Bundy headed west into Utah and chose to return to Salt Lake using Interstate 84. "We don't have any gas receipts that he stopped in the area," Lawrence said. It was Lawrence's theory that Bundy headed south on Highway 89, the same highway along which the Fina gas station in Layton was located. "There's no women missing along I-80, Lawrence said. There was no abduction on 80 coming in. Sheriff Lawrence stated his belief that Bundy kidnapped and killed Baird and then buried her body in Lambs Canyon. Ted Bundy was tired. He had driven all day, Lawrence surmised. "I believe he went to somewhere that was close. It was handy, it was safe, it was secure." Bundy was familiar with the area, with the body of one of his victims, Melissa Smith, found in Parley's Canyon. As part of the Baird investigation, the Davis County Sheriff's Office provided a sample of Nancy Baird's hair, taken from her hairbrush, to the FBI for comparison. This was tested against the unidentified hairs collected from Bundy's car. FBI records indicate the federal agents did not find a match to Nancy Baird's hair in Ted Bundy's car. During his 1979 trial for the Chi Omega murders, Bundy spoke with a reporter in a recorded telephone call, reiterating that he was innocent of all the crimes for which he had been accused and convicted. "Police officers, they want to solve crimes, and sometimes I don't think they really try to think things through," Bundy said during the call. "They're willing to take the convenient alternative, and the convenient alternative is me." At trial, Bundy was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death for the first time. At a later trial, he was found guilty of the murder of Kimberly Leach and received his second death sentence, for which he was placed on death row. While incarcerated on Florida's death row, Ted Bundy spoke with numerous law enforcement officials and journalists about his alleged crimes. He always protested his innocence. Bundy spoke about his crimes in the third person during his interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, but never admitted to any involvement. By January 1989, Ted Bundy had run out of time, and with his scheduled execution nearing, he decided to confess to crimes he had previously denied. He granted interviews with police investigators from several states who wanted to talk to Bundy about unsolved murders of missing women in their jurisdictions. Over the course of these interviews, Bundy claimed responsibility for a number of unsolved murders, describing to police the circumstances of the kidnappings and killings he carried out in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. On January 22, 1989, Salt Lake County Sheriff's Detective Dennis Couch interviewed Bundy for about 90 minutes. During the course of the interview, Bundy admitted to committing 5 murders, along with 3 unidentified in Utah. Bundy had long been suspected of involvement in the deaths or disappearances of Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Am, and Deborah Kent in Utah, and many in law enforcement speculated that Bundy could have been responsible for kidnapping and murdering Nancy Baird. The Bundy interview with Detective Couch was audio recorded, and Bundy can be heard denying having any knowledge of Nancy Baird. "Do you recall what type of place it was Baird was working at or where it was located?" Couch asked Bundy. "No, I didn't have anything to do with that," Bundy replied. Later in the interview, Couch showed Bundy a picture of Nancy Baird. "Nancy Baird, who's that?" Bundy asked Couch, seeming not to recognize Baird in the photograph. Bundy then goes on to say, "I'm not sure who you are talking about. No, I didn't have anything to do with that." With his denial of this crime and others, Bundy dashed hopes of detectives in identifying 3 of his alleged Utah victims, who remained identified. Former Sheriff William Lawrence didn't believe Bundy's denial. He admitted that he had some of the heads of his victims in Utah at his apartment, Lawrence said. He mentioned Lambs Canyon. Lawrence is not alone in his refusal to believe Bundy's culpability in Baird's murder. Nancy Baird's in-laws also believed Bundy was responsible for her murder. Wally Baird said he believed Bundy's denial may have been a cover-up. "He may have been that way because he didn't know at the time that she had kids, a child, and had been married," said Baird. "That was something that was contrary to his MO, method of operation." Lawrence said that Bundy's connection to Nancy had always been circumstantial. It was never enough for prosecutors to file charges against serial killer Ted Bundy, and believed that Nancy's fell through the cracks in my judgment, and I felt guilty about it. Her case was eventually pushed aside when other major homicide cases happened during that time period. However, Bundy did seem to have an alibi for the Nancy Baird disappearance. As the likely prime suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Baird, Ted Bundy has been considered responsible primarily due to the time frame she went missing, and the fact that he was active in Utah during 1974 and 1975. However, Bundy never admitted to kidnapping Baird, despite his 11th-hour confession to such crimes as the disappearance of Susan Curtis, who went missing in June 1975. During some of Bundy's crimes, his distinctive tan-colored 1968 Volkswagen Beetle had been seen. However, on the day of Nancy Baird's disappearance, there was no mention of a vehicle matching that description by witnesses at the Fina gas station. Furthermore, the suspects seen talking to Nancy at the store, described as hippie types, did not resemble Ted Bundy. After Bundy's attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch, the case file records revealed that he had briefly dated a Salt Lake City woman named Leslie Knudsen during the summer of 1975. Following Bundy's arrest, Knudsen provided a statement to police about her relationship with Bundy, giving details and dates. One of those dates was July 4, 1975, when Knudsen said Bundy had visited her family at a reunion that occurred at her family's ranch. Knudsen's maternal grandfather was a prominent sheep rancher who owned a ranch in Fruitland, near Strawberry Reservoir, which is located more than 100 miles from the Fina station in East Layton. From Knudsen's statement, Bundy seems to have a solid alibi for the date of Nancy Baird's abduction, in that he was over 100 miles away at the time. It would have been difficult, albeit not impossible, for Bundy to make the journey that day. Bundy was known to undertake long journeys in search of victims. One former law enforcement officer believes that Bundy had no part in the Baird case and offers his own suspect. Thomas Jackson, a former East Layton Police Reserve officer, was in July 1975 the most junior member of the East Layton Police Force. Jackson had little participation in the Baird investigation, but did not agree with the Bundy speculation. Jackson believed that a fellow officer, Dave Anderson, might have been the culprit. Anderson had been the law enforcement officer who was present at the Fina gas station on the day Nancy Baird went missing, and was one of the last people to see her before she vanished after the two reportedly spoke. At the time of Baird's disappearance, Officer Anderson had only been an officer at East Layton for 10 months, and the majority of his time with the department had been spent patrolling U.S. Highway 89. Former Reserve Officer Thomas Jackson stated that Officer Dave Anderson had spent a great deal of time at the Fina gas station and convenience store. Anderson spent too much time looking at women too, Jackson said. Shortly after she went missing, Anderson left his job with the East Layton Police Department, and case records do not indicate he was ever challenged concerning his account of the circumstances of Nancy Baird's disappearance. Thomas Jackson replaced Dave Anderson as East Layton's only full-time officer, but decided to defer handling the Nancy Baird investigation, telling the Davis County Sheriff's Office he preferred they manage the case. "I wanted to let someone else handle it," Jackson said. "I didn't want to mess it up." By January 1981, the town of East Layton disincorporated and was annexed into Layton City. 5 years later, Officer Jackson also quit the department to take a job in the private security sector. As a result, the Nancy Baird investigation became a cold case, with little or any developments beyond the Ted Bundy theory. Over the years, Baird has been ruled out as the identity of several bodies of young women, including Salt Lake City Jane Doe and Washoe County Jane Doe. The Davis County Sheriff's Office have assigned an investigator to review the cold case, in cooperation with the Layton City Police Department. The current focus of this new cold case investigation is on persons of interest other than Ted Bundy. That Baird's body has never been found still haunts the former Sheriff William Lawrence. He continues to firmly believe that Ted Bundy was responsible for the disappearance of Nancy Baird. "It's what we call the law of probability," Lawrence said. "It's not provable, but if you work back by process of elimination, you come up with the most logical scenario." Case 3. In late December 2012, Ian Watkins from Lost Prophets, the lead singer and frontman of the Welsh rock band, was arrested by police in relation to allegations of child sex abuse. The singer's home was searched, and officers found a number of indecent images. The resulting court case would go on to reveal the full, horrifying extent of Ian Watkins' depraved crimes against young children, something he managed to conceal for many years. Born in Merthyr Tydfil on July 30, 1977, Ian David Carslake Watkins moved with his family to Pontypridd, where he attended Hawthorne High School. There, he met one of his future Lost Prophet bandmates, Mike Lewis. Watkins went to the University of Wales, Newport, where he graduated with a first-class honors degree in graphic design. Watkins grew up listening to mostly metal and rock music, along with Lewis, who shared a passion for bands such as Faith No More. Together they formed Aftermath in 1991. However, the band never recorded any material. Watkins then met another future bandmate, Lee Gaze, and they decided to form a new band. However, this too was short-lived. By 1997, Watkins, Lewis, and Gaze formed a new band, Lost Prophets, which made its debut in May 1997, with Watkins as the lead vocalist. The band launched their debut album, The Fake Sound of Progress, in 2000. They would go on to release 5 studio albums between the years 2000 to 2012, earning them millions along with legions of fans. When on tour with his band, Ian Watkins requested his own private dressing room, separate from the other 5 band members. It was unknown at the time why he wanted this private space, and only after his crimes came to light would it become apparent. As a result, his bandmates went on to claim they knew nothing of what went on, citing his heavy drug use as a contributing factor in their strained relations. Indeed, Watkins used his private dressing room as a place to take female fans, something that many other musical stars have done in the past with adoring fans they wished to entertain. However, what went on inside Watkins' dressing room was anything but entertaining. One incident would be shared with the court at his later trial. In March 2007, he met a 16-year-old Lost Prophets fans at one of the band's concerts. The prosecution went on to describe for police what happened. They said the singer was excited at the prospect of taking the young girl's virginity, and had her dress up in a schoolgirl's uniform, and videoed them having oral, vaginal, and anal sex. He asked her whether she enjoyed being his underage slut, and at the end urinated over her face and told her to drink it. This encounter was an insight into how the singer treated young women, and was indicative of his attitude towards those he saw as mere playthings. This incident occurred fully 5 years before Watkins committed his most serious crimes. Watkins met another fan in August 2008 and videoed this girl, also 16, having oral sex with him. On the video she is seen snorting white powder, which the singer told her was cocaine. It was this taking of hard drugs, intrinsically linked to his sexual activities, that caused him to step further away from his bandmates. In 2006, a 30-year-old fan contacted Watkins on the Lost Prophets MySpace account in order to arrange tickets for a gig. Watkins and the fan, Joan Jadzelix, started a relationship, one that she later described as quickly turning sordid. She told police that Watkins had talked about getting her pregnant so that he could rape their baby. The couple also talked about child abuse while having sex. In an online chat, revealed to the court at her later trial, Jadzelix and Watkins discussed topics such as incest, while acting out a fantasy the singer had of them being brother and sister. They also talked about cross-dressing, child abuse, and the kidnapping of a brother and sister from outside a school, with the intention of killing one and raping the other. Jadzelix, from Doncaster in South Yorkshire, said that in September 2007, during the recording of the band's 4th studio album, The Betrayed, Watkins described to her how he raped a 12-year-old girl in Los Angeles. At Christmas that year, Watkins sent her an indecent photograph of a 5-year-old girl posing with cocaine, who the singer described as super flirty. Watkins reportedly told her, "You know what little girls are like." She recalled how the image sickened her, saying, "My heart sank because it made me ill." As a result of that image, Jadzelix decided to end her relationship with Watkins. "I was completely confused. I was totally in love with the man, yet he sent me this picture," she said. "How could I be in love with a man that sends that image? And he lied," she recalled, saying he only got her to pose with the picture as a joke. Around this same time, Watkins told her that he had also been abusing a 2-year-old child in California, whilst the band was recording in Los Angeles. Jadzelix claimed she then went and reported the incidents to South Wales police. However, no further action was taken. She wouldn't see Watkins again until several times in 2010, where on one occasion he tried to get her to snort heroin, before showing her something on his laptop. She described the video. "The first thing I saw was a child crying and screaming, and I saw a video of a young girl being raped. And I looked at him, and I just saw an evil smirk on his face. He was looking for a reaction, and all I did was cry, and I said he had to go. Joan Jadzelik said she had never met anyone as sick and depraved as that man, and that it was then she decided to play Watkins at his own game. She went to police again, this time to tell them about another woman who was allowing her baby to be abused by Ian Watkins from Lost Prophets. She told police the woman was totally obsessed with Watkins and her baby will be raped by him. Jadzelik's claimed an officer dismissed her claim, telling her she must have been really upset by her ex-boyfriend. She reportedly told the officer, "I'll put a bullet in his head to stop his doing it." As a result, she said police force records labeled her a nut job. Lawyers for Watkins issued Jadzelik with harassment orders, calling the testimony she gave police as bullshit. She took the woman whose baby was being raped by Watkins to the police, but she claimed they ignored her warnings. She said of Watkins, "He was getting off on the fact he was getting away with it," Jadzelik said. As a result of her failed efforts to get Watkins arrested, Joan Jadzelik began suffering with her mental health, which caused her to take overdoses in an effort to commit suicide. Eventually, she decided to distance herself from Watkins, and even went so far as to put an obituary for herself in the newspaper in an effort to fake her own death. In late 2011, Watkins met a 19-year-old woman who would be referred to in court documents as Woman B. The two began communicating regularly, and by March and April 2012, the discussions between them became sinister. By this time, Woman B had a young child, a 10-month-old son, and with Watkins she had conversations about committing sexual acts with the infant. Woman B later told the police she met up with Watkins at the Copthorne Hotel in Cardiff, and on March 21st, he asked her to come down this weekend, and we can fuck him up again. In response, Woman B replied offering up her child to Watkins' perversions, after previously suggesting getting her son high on ice or methamphetamine. The two met up again at the K West Hotel in London on the night of April 2nd to 3rd, and there recorded a video. During the recorded, Watkins raped the child, who had been offered up by his mother for the singer to abuse. On the recording she can be heard encouraging Watkins in his actions, taking an active part in her own child's pain and suffering, and both can be heard on the video to be gaining enjoyment from the act. On May 24th, Woman B messaged Watkins and told him, "The boy is ready to be abused." A further message from Watkins, sent on August 2nd, read, "To be honest though, I think we have gone easy on him so far. Time to teach him and make him learn to love it." From these messages, police believe the two met up at the Maldron Hotel in Cardiff, where further abuse occurred. An image sent by Woman B to Watkins on September 9th showed a grotesque sex act she committed against her own child. By August 2012, Watkins started communicating with a second woman and mother to a young child. This 25-year-old, who was known as Woman P in court documents, told police that not long after they began talking, their conversations turned to child sex abuse. The couple talked of moving in together, and Watkins told Woman P, "If you belong to me, so does you our baby." In response, she told him, "Understandable, a mother-daughter slave duo worshipping you." Watkins replied, "That's all she will know, a life of filth." They spoke of sexually abusing the young child, and during subsequent communications they planned even more depraved acts, including forcing bestiality with the child, and even the taking of drugs. Watkins considered the small child as a mere plaything, not as a human being, but a sexual object there for his own pleasure. He said he wanted to get both mother and daughter taking crack cocaine, and talked of whoring her out to fat old men who would pay thousands. He even spoke of torturing the small child for fun. Woman P took intimate photographs of her daughter and sent them to Watkins, and in turn he commented on his intentions with her. On September 12, 2012, Watkins and Woman P had a lengthy Skype session, which would prove to be some of the most disturbing and graphic evidence presented at their later trials. On October 2nd, Woman P took her young daughter to meet up with Watkins at the Travel Lodge in Carfilly, and also to the Radisson in Cardiff on the October 23rd. It was unknown what happened at these meetups, and Woman P allegedly lied, claiming she left her child with someone else. However, it is believed she took her baby, and together they committed abuse, rape, and sexual assault. The police investigation into the crimes of Ian Watkins had been codenamed Operation Globe, which had been set up after the failures to investigate Watkins and his crimes had been scrutinized by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPC. With multiple opportunities to look into Watkins' crimes from the many complaints concerning his crimes of child sexual abuse, a team of 25 officers were assigned to work the case. Beginning in October 2012, and led by Detective Chief Inspector Peter Doyle, the Operation Globe team worked to uncover the horrific sexual crimes against young children, and included officers from Germany and the USA. The operation also required the cooperation of GCHQ to decrypt a hidden drive on Watkins' laptop. Once investigators bypassed the encrypted password to his laptop, they learned it read, "I fuck kids," and his device was found to contain video evidence of his abuses. Among the trove were images he had made himself. DCI Doyle said after the investigation had concluded, "This investigation was highly complex and involved a large team working closely with partners including local authorities, NSBCC, and Interpol. The team showed moral and professional courage in the face of harrowing and deeply upsetting evidence, which was by far the worst I have come across in my 30-year career." Throughout the investigation, the central core of the investigation focused upon the protection of children, and the team never wavered from that goal. Several years after the case had concluded, the Operation Globe investigation team was named runner-up in the Police Federation National Detective Forum, PFNDF, Detective Investigation of the Year Award. DCI Doyle said, "They thoroughly deserve the recognition they have received from the Police Federation, and I am pleased their hard work, professionalism, and dedication has been acknowledged." As a result of the investigation, a number of serving officers were under examination by the IPCC in relation to possible delays in bringing Watkins to justice. The roles of as many as 8 officers were being looked into, which was part of an IPCC probe that began before Operation Globe was set up. The officers included 2 South Wales police officers, 1 a detective constable, along with the roles of a sergeant and 3 constables from South Yorkshire Police and a sergeant and constable from Bedfordshire Police that were being looked at. It was revealed South Wales Police received information from 4 different police forces across Britain about Watkins' crimes. Watkins was first apprehended in June 2012, several months before he met Woman P, in connection to various drug charges, and he was granted bail shortly afterwards. He was arrested again on November 4, 2012 for drug possession, and a separate allegation that he possessed an obscene image of a child. South Wales Police were finally acting on information provided by witnesses. From 2008 to 2011, a total of 6 people, including Joan Jadzelix, had spoken to the police in regards to Watkins' conduct. Arrested for a 3rd time on December 17, 2012 on another drug possession charge, South Wales Police immediately conducted a search of his home. They focused on his computer in connection to their prior investigation and allegations made against him. During the search, officers discovered numerous indecent images of children stored on his computer. Of the images found, there were 90 indecent photos of children, including 45 at level 4 and 2 at level 5. Many other images and videos were of extreme pornography, along with 22 images of bestiality, including oral and vaginal sex with dogs. The ages of the child in the images ranged from 2 to 14 years old. Appearing before Cardiff Magistrates Court on December 19, 2012, Watkins was charged with conspiracy to engage in sexual activity with a 1-year-old girl and possession and/or distribution of indecent images of children and extreme animal pornography. Owing to the seriousness of the charges, he was remanded in custody. His 2 female co-accused, Woman B and Woman P, had also been arrested and charged. Watkins denied the accusations, claiming he had no involvement in the alleged crimes. Imprisoned at HM Prison Park in Bridgend, he appeared before Video Link at Cardiff Crown Court on December 31st, and was remanded in custody until March 11, 2013. The trial date was set for July 15th, and at a hearing on June 3rd, Watkins denied all the charges when appearing before Video Link. 3 days later, it was announced that the trial of Watkins and his 2 female co-accused would start on November 25th, and was expected to last a month. Watkins' lawyers attempted to have the venue moved outside Wales, but this request was denied. On November 26th, on the 2nd day of the trial when the jury had been sworn in, Watkins and Woman P admitted to the charges, with Watkins pleading guilty to attempted rape and sexual assault of a child under 13, but not guilty to rape. This plea was accepted by the prosecution, halting the trial. He further pleaded guilty to 3 counts of sexual assault involving children. This included 6 counts of taking, making, or possessing indecent images of children, and 1 count of possessing an extreme pornographic image involving a sex act on an animal. The day after his guilty plea, a telephone conversation at HM Prison Park was recorded between Watkins and a female fan, in which he referred to his sex offenses as megalols. At a sentencing hearing on December 18th, Mr. Justice Royce said the court had heard a large number of horrific cases over the years, but that this case, however, breaks new ground, adding, "What you 3 did plumbed new depths of depravity." To Watkins he said, "You achieved fame and success as the lead singer of the Lost Prophets. You had many fawning fans. That gave you power. You knew you could use that power to induce young female fans to help satisfy your apparently insatiable lust and to take part in the sexual abuse of their young children. Away from the highlights of your public performances lay a dark and sinister side. Because she entered her guilty plea at the first reasonable opportunity, Woman B was entitled to a standard 1/3 discount on her sentence. Because Watkins and P waited until just before the jury was sworn in on the second day of the trial, they received no credit, but were given the conventional 10% off their sentences. Watkins was considered the most dangerous by the judge, and in his closing remarks he said of Ian Watkins and his crimes, "Mr. Watkins presents a high risk of causing serious sexual, physical, emotional, and psychological harm to children, both male and female, and to women, specifically his female sexual partners. I have no hesitation in concluding that there is a significant risk to the public, in particular to young females and children, of serious harm occasioned by the commission by you of further specified offenses. That risk is high." Woman B was found to have an infatuation with Watkins, while Woman P was assessed by a psychologist who concluded that she had a mixed personality disorder. There was a low risk that either woman was reoffend again. Woman B was said to show genuine remorse for her crimes, while the judge said there were signs of remorse from Woman P, and that they shared a corrupting influence under Watkins. The guidelines in determining Watkins' sentence included the planning and its graphic detail of his crimes, and the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable victim. The abuse of trust in the cases of B and P, the commission of the offenses by 2 people acting together, and the abuse of power in the case of Watkins along with the commission of offenses whilst under the influence of drugs. The most serious considerations were the fact that a baby was a particularly vulnerable victim. In the case of Watkins, there was more than one victim, along with repeated assaults on the same victim. In addition, the court took into account the degradation through taking photos or videos as part of the offending. The court was unable to determine the effect the abuse would have on Watkins' young victims, but considered it likely they would develop psychological difficulties as a result of coming to terms with what happened. In sentencing the accused, Mr. Justice Royce handed Watkins a 29-year prison term, with eligibility to apply for parole in 2031 after serving 2/3 of his prison term, followed by 6 years of supervised release for a total of 35 years. Woman B was given a 14-year sentence, while Woman P, owing to nature of her enthusiastic complicity in Watkins' crimes, was sentenced to 17 years. A senior investigating officer on the case described Watkins as a committed, organized pedophile, and potentially the most dangerous sex offender he had ever seen. He was sent from HM Prison Park to HM Prison Wakefield to begin serving his sentence. He was later transferred to HM Prison Long Lartin in 2014 in order to be closer to his mother. On October 9, 2017, Watkins was accused of grooming a single 21-year-old mother from prison through a series of letters. A Lost Prophets fan since she was 16, the young woman from Lincolnshire visited Watkins in prison after he sent her a letter in 2016 in which he claimed to love her. It was also alleged that Watkins made jokes about her 2-year-old watching her have sex. The child was taken into care once social services were alerted that the woman had contacted the pedophile singer. A spokesperson for the NSBCC said, "We're sickened," adding, "It's utterly bewildering that he could carry on grooming. It shows contempt for children he abused, and raises serious questions about supervision." A friend of the mother revealed she visited Watkins in prison in November 2016, and discovered that he had put on 4 stone, his hair had turned gray, and his teeth were rotting. He then allegedly asked if her daughter came into the room during sex. It was at that point the woman said she began to feel scared, but vowed to never let him have any contact with her daughter. After it was discovered that the pair had been communicating, police seized her mobile phone and laptop in December, before taking the child into care. The woman then returned to visit Watkins in January 2018 to inform him of what had happened, before coming back again in March. Prison officials in Wakefield, where he had been transferred, reportedly found nothing untoward in their exchanges via letters and emails. In March 2018, Watkins was found to be in possession of a mobile phone and was accused of using it to maintain contact with a girlfriend outside prison, a charge which he denied. A search of his cell produced the charger for the phone. Watkins said the phone belonged to two inmates who forced him to hide it for them, but refused to give their names for fear of incurring violent retribution. In August 2019, Watkins attended trial at Leeds Crown Court, during which he claimed to still receive fan mail from Lost Prophets fans, and that the men wanted him to help them take advantage of the women writing in as a revenue stream. Watkins reportedly paid a Liverpool-based gang member for access to the mobile device. He was reportedly paying £1,000 for its use. However, upon being caught with the phone in custody, this amount increased to £5,000. At the conclusion of the 5-day trial, Watkins was convicted and sentenced to a further 10 months in prison, a term that was to run consecutively with his existing sentence. At HM Prison Wakefield, where Watkins remained incarcerated, a hostage situation occurred on the morning of August 5, 2023, when 3 inmates held Watkins against his will. He suffered stab wounds, but was freed some 6 hours later by prison officers. It was confirmed by police that his injuries were not life-threatening. The motive for the attack was allegedly a 600-pound drugs debt owed by Watkins to another prisoner, who used a sharpened toilet brush as a makeshift weapon. Shortly after the incident, Watkins was reported to have spent his time buying both protection and friendships from other inmates, with assistance from family and friends who arranged bank transfers to the inmates' accounts. Shortly after, Ian Watkins was charged with 13 sexual offenses against children, including the attempted rape of a 1-year-old girl. The other band members of Lost Prophets posted a message on their website describing how they were learning about the details of the investigation along with you, concluding, "It is a difficult time for us and our families, and we want to thank our fans for their support as we seek answers." All tour dates were subsequently canceled, and on October 1, 2013, the band announced they would be disbanding after nearly a year of coming to terms with our heartache. Once Watkins pleaded guilty to his crimes, the band posted a lengthy statement, saying how they were heartbroken, angry, and disgusted. The band members stated that they had been unaware of his many crimes, and that though working with him had become a constant, miserable challenge, they had never imagined him capable of behavior of the type he has now admitted, and urged any other victims to contact the authorities. Immediately after Watkins was sentenced, the BBC banned the entire Lost Prophets back catalog from being played on their stations. In years when Ian Watkins was perpetrating his crimes against defenseless children, the police had numerous opportunities to stop him. However, the reports from people such as his ex-girlfriend Joan Jedzelix went unheeded. This was most likely because of his fame, something that has given monsters such as Watkins and Jimmy Savile a certain measure of immunity. It was the immunity from suspicion that allowed Watkins to continue to several years, to corrupt others and abuse the most vulnerable of victims, all while projecting to the world an image of a professional who was above suspicion. However, behind closed doors, Watkins was revealed to be one of the most degenerate and evil of serial offenders. Case 4. On Florida's death row, serial killer Ted Bundy attempted to bargain for more time by giving up his secrets to detectives. He offered information on the unsolved murders of young women in several western states during the 1970s, and one of the cases Bundy was questioned about was the death of Sandra Weaver, who was found in Colorado after her abduction from Utah. Born on August 4, 1955, to Marlene and Bruno Weaver in Arcadia, Wisconsin, where she grew up in the family home alongside her 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Weaver attended the Western Wisconsin Technological Institute in La Crosse, and by June 1974 had finished her first year when she decided to travel to Utah with a girlfriend. Weaver and Joan Elkins planned to work for a few weeks before returning home for the fall college term and the marriage of Sandra's sister in late July. The girls hitchhiked to Salt Lake City, Utah, and there found residence at the trailer home of a young man they had met in Utah. Together they found work at a warehouse in Salt Lake City. On the morning of July 1, 1974, Elkins reported in sick for work, and so Sandra, who was known as Sandy to family and friends, went in alone. She never returned to the trailer, and Elkins said the warehouse called in the afternoon to say that Sandra had not returned to work after she took a lunch break at about 10:30 a.m. Joan Elkins then reported her friend as missing to the Salt Lake City police. She told officers she had no idea where or with whom Sandra may have gone. "We didn't have anybody we knew in Salt Lake City," she said. Elkins then stayed in Utah until mid-August, hoping to find Sandra before returning to Wisconsin. Salt Lake City police had no idea what had happened to 18-year-old Weaver, and initially suspected her disappearance temporary, and that she might reappear. During this time, there were several missing women reported in Washington, but nothing to connect the disappearance of Sandra Weaver to what was happened hundreds of miles away. On July 2, 1974, only a day after Sandra Weaver went missing, a body was discovered by tourists hiking in the Deepens Canyon in Colorado at about 3 p.m. near the Colorado River on .s. 6-24 about 16 miles east of Palisade. The woman, found face down in some brush, had been beaten and stripped naked, with no clothing found near the body. It was estimated the young woman was between the ages of 15 and 21 years old, white, between 5-7 and 5-8 tall, 120 to 135 pounds with dark shoulder-length hair and a fair complexion. In addition to the lack of clothing found at the scene, there were no personal effects except for a gold chain with a 1-inch wooden cross and a blue sapphire ring. Possibly the most important information, and one that might help police identify the girl, was the contact lenses worn by the victim, which were blue-tinted with red identification marks, and her teeth, which indicated extensive dental work. In an effort to identify the woman, Mesa County Sheriff's Department deputies said the office had gotten a number of inquiries as a result of sent out across the United States. The Montrose pathologist, Dr. Thomas Canfield, conducted further tests in an attempt to learn the actual cause of death. It was determined the girl had been beaten with fists and had died of suffocation, then dragged to the spot in Deepens Canyon. After several months of fruitless searching, police eventually identified the Jane Doe. In January 1975, Sheriff's investigator Milo Vigg said that dental charts and contact lenses of the victim matched those of Sandra Jean Weaver. When police contacted Sandra's family, her father Bruno Weaver confirmed to detectives that his daughter had left home in June 1974 and hitchhiked to Salt Lake City, Utah to find a summer job. Several months after the disappearance of Sandra Weaver, other young women started to go missing in Utah. In October 1974, 3 young women seemingly vanished. The first, Nancy Wilcox, was never found, while the bodies of 2 others, Melissa Smith and Laura M., were found 9 and 20 days respectively after they disappeared. Smith and M had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Like Weaver, the bodies of Smith and M were found dumped in canyons east of Salt Lake, and all 3 had been found naked and beaten, with May's face beaten beyond recognition by her killer. As a result of these similarities, detectives suspected a connection between these cases and thought as many as 5 murder and an equal number of disappearances might have been committed by the same killer. This serial killer theory was shared by detectives in Washington, where as many as 8 young women had gone missing the previous year, with only scattered remains and bones that might indicate their whereabouts. Captain Pete Hayward of the Salt Lake Sheriff's Department said that officers were checking into the slayings of girls in other western states. These were specifically Wyoming, Nevada, and New Mexico, places where the bodies of young girls have been found or young women reported missing. In August 1975, over a year after Sandra Weaver had disappeared and several months after her body had been found, Utah Patrolman Bob Hayward arrested a suspicious young man in a Salt Lake City suburb. The man was identified as Ted Bundy, a student at the University of Utah Law School, and was driving a Volkswagen Beetle, a vehicle that was described as being at the scene of 2 abductions of young women that occurred on the same day at Lake Sammamish State Park in July 1974. The women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, were never found. At the time of his capture, Bundy was on a list of suspects that contained the names of Volkswagen owners named Ted, as well as suspected sex offenders. In his Volkswagen Beetle, police found number items such as a ski mask, rope, a pair of handcuffs, a crowbar, and a pantyhose mask. These items were described as a murder kit. Bundy had moved to Utah in September 1974, several months after the disappearance of Sandra Weaver. Ted Bundy was eventually charged with the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years. This was not the end of Bundy's legal problems, and he was soon being investigated over the murder of nurse Karen Campbell, who was abducted from a snowmass ski resort in January 1975. After his second escape from confinement, Bundy traveled to Florida in 1978, where he was suspected of orchestrating the Chi Omega murders and the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. For these crimes, Bundy would eventually be sentenced to death during 2 separate trials. On death row, Bundy steadfastly refused to admit to his crimes, despite his many admissions to the FBI about his knowledge of serial murder and offer of assistance in the then unsolved Green River Killer investigation. As his execution date approached, Bundy tried desperately to gain more time by confessing to crimes. After his execution in January 1989, details began to emerge of the crimes. Bundy made confessions of his involvement. One of those was the Sandra Weaver case, which investigators had long suspected Bundy of committing. Mesa County Sheriff's Lieutenant Reek Clausen said after Bundy's death, Bundy did not confess to Weaver's disappearance. There was talk of him murdering a woman in Utah and then taking her to Colorado, but there was nothing to tie it to Weaver. This admission matched the circumstances of Sandra Weaver's abduction and murder. However, there was never any evidence that connected Bundy to her case, apart from Bundy's taped confession. On that tape, Bundy was interviewed by Detective Dennis Couch and other investigators, who said the serial killer gave Couch specific names, dates and places on some Utah murders, and gave less detailed information on others. Bundy has given information, he said, that there were a total of 8 Utah victims, said Utah Sheriff Pete Hayward. Bundy talked in specifics about the 5 cases we pointed out to him, but beyond that I don't want to comment at this time. Clausen later said that he heard nothing more than rumors, that Bundy had confessed to killing Weaver. Bundy was a consideration at the time, Clausen said. We knew he had been in the area around that time because of a gas receipt. We were quite certain he was involved in the murder of a different girl. At the time we couldn't really pin the Weaver murder on him. With Ted Bundy's death, and his refusal to confess directly to the murder of Sandra Weaver, her murder remains unknown. However, there are reportedly no other suspects considered in her case. Case 5. During his death row confessions, serial killer Ted Bundy gave investigators details on many murder cases for which he was suspected of committing, but never charged. One of those was of missing high school student Lynette Culver, who disappeared in Pocatello, Idaho on May 6, 1975, and who was long thought to be a victim of another suspected serial killer. Originally born in Washington State on July 31, 1962, Lynette Dawn Culver grew up in Pocatello, Idaho, where she lived with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Culver, at 237 Fairbanks. A 7th grader at Alameda Junior High, Lynette was described by her family as a typical preteen, while her teachers knew her as a good student who sometimes liked to skip class. On the afternoon of May 6, 1975, Lynette disappeared. The last time anyone saw her, she was last seen leaving her school during her lunch break, during which she reportedly boarded a bus Hawthorne Junior High, a journey that would take her to Fort Hall. Reported missing after she failed to return to school, investigators were unable to determine why Lynette would go to Fort Hall. She was described as 5 feet 2 inches tall, with blue eyes and long brown hair, and weighing about 105 pounds. Although only 12, Lynette was by all accounts older in appearance. On the day of her disappearance, she was known to be wearing blue jeans and a red checkered shirt with a maroon fur-collared jacket. There were never any reports about Culver's whereabouts, and investigators could take the case no further without proof that she had been either kidnapped and held against her will or murdered. The body of Lynette Culver was never found, and police had no idea what happened to the young schoolgirl. Around this same time, serial killer Ted Bundy was kidnapping and killing young women throughout the states of Washington, Utah, and Colorado. His victim of choice was almost always a young college-aged woman, pretty, with her hair parted in the middle. However, there were several factors what led detectives to believe that Bundy was not responsible for the disappearance of Culver. Bundy's victims were always much older than Culver, who at 12 would have been his youngest victim up to that point in his murder spree. This, coupled with the fact that he had not, to the knowledge of law enforcement, ventured into Idaho in search of potential victims. He had started in Washington State, before moving to Utah, and then expanding into Colorado when police began to link his crimes to a single perpetrator. Several years after the disappearance of Lynette, there were a rash of other missing girls in Pocatello that police suspected might have been connected to Culver. Although these disappearances occurred many years after, it was believed that each of the young girls had met their end at the hands of the same killer. 15-year-old Patricia Campbell had last been seen at Alameda Park in Pocatello, Idaho, on July 22, 1978. That day the park was the location of a Pioneer Day celebration, and coincidentally another girl, 12-year-old Tina Anderson, disappeared in the park that same day. Although the girls did know each other, it was reported they were not close friends. After Tina failed to show up at a babysitting job that evening across the street from the park, family members reported the girls missing to the Pocatello Police Department. 3 years later, another young girl went missing. 14-year-old Linda Smith was abducted from her Pocatello home at 239 N. 8th on June 14, 1981. While babysitting her 9-year-old brother, an unknown man had rushed into the family home at around 2 in the morning, dragging Linda out of her bedroom and into his vehicle. Her younger brother described the unknown man as white and said he had his arm wrapped around Linda, who was kicking and screaming, trying to get away, before being shoved into a van with white flames painted on the sides. Despite the description of the abductor, police had little to go on, and little progress was made in the case. May suspected Linda has merely run away from home. Even when Linda's clothes were found in a ditch a week later by a city employee, police still did not believe she was the victim of a kidnapping. The following May, 11 months after she was last seen, remains were found below Hospital Way on a hilly area near East Center Street in Pocatello. They were positively identified as those of the missing Linda Smith. The cause of death was never determined. The Smith family believed that the investigation had been botched from the start. Later that same year, on October 15, 1981, some partial remains were discovered when hunters stumbled upon bones about 60 miles away in rural Oneida County. Clothing found was identified as belonging to Patricia was also found at the scene. At the scene, the sheriff's office also retrieved .22 caliber bullet casings. Missing Tina Anderson would soon be identified through dental records. However, the other remains thought to be Patricia's could not be positively identified. With one girl missing, and the remains of 2 others found, police began looking into the theory that these cases were somehow connected and that an unidentified serial killer might be responsible. On June 5, 1983, another young girl went missing. Sometime between the hours of 11:45 p.m. and 1:45 a.m., 14-year-old Cindy Bringhurst vanished while babysitting at an apartment in the 100 block of Highland Boulevard, Pocatello. The following month in July, her body was found by a fisherman partially submerged in a stream in the Mink Creek area west of Pocatello. Cindy had graduated from Alameda Junior High School, the same school which Lynette Culver was attending when she went missing. As in the case of the other missing girl, detectives were unable to determine what happened to Cindy. 3 years later, on October 26, 1986, a partial skull lacking a mandible was discovered by hunters in the same area as the remains belonging to Tina and the still unidentified young girl believed to be Patricia Campbell. An examination of the skull indicated that the victim died due to being repeatedly struck with a blunt object. She was determined to have been white and aged between 12 and 16 years. After this, the skull was misplaced by law enforcement and was unable to be located for years, until it resurfaced in 2018. In 2006, the Oneida County Sheriff's Office began to search for the unidentified remains found in 1981. At some point during this search, the remains were rediscovered in the department's evidence storage area. DNA testing was performed on these remains, and they were confirmed to be Patricia's in March 2007. Efforts to help identify the skull found in 1986 began in 2021, with the assistance of Othram. DNA testing eventually confirmed the skull belonged to Patricia in October 2022. The murders of the 4 young Pocatello girls between 1978 and 1983 have never been solved, although in recent years police have come to suspect they might not have been committed by the same killer. In the years since Lynette Culver's disappearance and the discovery of the remains of the missing Idaho girls, Ted Bundy went on to commit further murders in Florida. There, on February 9, 1978, he kidnapped and killed 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, who would be his youngest victim. Long suspected of targeting only adult victims, the revelation that Bundy raped and murdered Leach then opened up the possibility that he might be responsible for claiming younger victims. However, with Ted Bundy on death row, he steadfastly refused to admit to his crimes, protesting only that he was innocent. Meanwhile, at the same time he gave detailed interviews to journalists on his suspected crimes, and talking about murder in the third person, so as to prevent him from prosecution. Bundy remained a suspect in Culver's disappearance. Finally, during his last days before his scheduled execution, Bundy decided to use his victims in a last-ditch attempt to buy himself more time. He believed he could use details of his unsolved crimes as bargaining chips with detectives, in the hopes that it would prolong his life. Although Bundy did confess to crimes he was never convicted, his execution date was not postponed. He went on to confess to as many as 20 murders of young women throughout Washington, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, and Idaho. One of those Bundy talked about in Idaho was Lynette Culver, and he made a startling admission. Ted Bundy went on to describe how on May 6, 1975, he was parked outside of the Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles, 255 kilometers, north of Salt Lake City. He said he saw a young girl walking along by herself, and decided to try and lure her into his vehicle, a Volkswagen Beetle, that had been used in his previous crimes. Once Culver accepted a ride, he drove her to his Holiday Inn hotel room. There, he said he raped Culver before drowning her in the bathtub. Bundy said he disposed of her body in the Snake River north of Pocatello. If detectives were still dubious about this admission, Bundy gave them more by reportedly provided intimate details about Lynette's personal life in his confession. Police would get no further time to question Bundy, as his time had run out. On January 24, 1989, he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison for the murder of Kimberly Leach. With his confession, police believed that Lynette had fallen victim to Bundy, a cold-blooded serial killer who claimed the lives of as many as 30 young women. Case 6. On a warm autumn evening in 1961, 8-year-old Marie Burr went to bed along with her younger sibling. Several hours later, she woke to tell her mother that her young sibling was crying, and the two children were settled back to sleep. It was the last time her parents saw her. At some point in the night, little Marie